David was thinking of going to some place where he could find the peace and quiet to work on his project, the book. One of the elders, Linda Fleming, told him that her family owned a farmhouse in the country, 2 counties to the east. It was uninhabited now. Her parents were deceased, and the family used it as an occasional place to go for weekends and holidays. Though the location was truly rural, not what Linda called themed country, the home was fully equipped with dishware and linen, electric and water, and even indoor plumbing, Linda said, laughing. David thanked her for her generous offer of the homestead and said that he and Denise would drive out to see it. He didn't really intend to, but Denise thought it would be a nice excursion, at the very least, and she hoped that getting out would lift his spirits, so she encouraged him to go. They drove out. It was nearly a 2-hour trip, the last 45 minutes on windy, swooping, narrow country roads where it was impossible to make any time, which was fine because they were in no hurry, because they were not going anywhere in particular, not that he knew of. And yet, the further they went, the more detached David felt, as if being freed somehow. They both loved the farmhouse, even from the outside, and the inside was just as charming. The furnishings were spare and rustic and very appealing to them both. David wrote out a note. Everything looks handmade, and he indicated the chairs, seat covers, and tables. I'll bet they built the house themselves, too, said Denise, and David nodded. They went through the house, then outside it. There was a flower garden in the front and a vegetable garden in back. Both were badly overrun with weeds. All around the farm, on both sides of the road, were fields of corn and soybeans. Back at their car, David wrote another note. Could you be happy here? Denise saw herself as a minister's wife. A minister's wife goes where her husband must go. She and David had long ago agreed that anyone married to a minister might just as well take the same vows, plus a few extra ones, because their life was also in the hands of God. It's up to you, said Denise. I could be happy here if you were happy. David stood and looked around. A car passed on the road. The sound of its tires approaching and then driving away was the only sound other than the sighing of a slight breeze through the corn husks. I don't know, he wrote finally. Let's sleep on it. They started back to their home in the city. Not 10 minutes from the farm, Denise said, David, look at this. Stop. He did. She was pointing at a sign which read, St. Ellen's School for the Deaf. A narrow roadway twisted off into the woods on the right and disappeared. David turned down it and drove through the woods into a clearing. There was a large 3-story white wooden building with several other white wooden buildings around it. David stopped the car, got out, and stared at the structures with disbelief. The large building looked something like a church, and indeed was topped with a white wooden cross. A woman dressed in a nun's habit saw them and crossed from the steps of the large building through a mown field to their car. She moved her hands in what David recognized was sign language. David smiled and waved to her. Denise said, Good afternoon, sister. We were driving past and saw your sign. What a beautiful school. Thank you, said the nun. You're more than welcome to visit. We don't get many visitors. Impulsively, David grabbed his pad and wrote a note on top of the car, then held it up for Denise to see. I want to stay, he wrote. They moved their clothes and a few other belongings out to the farmhouse in several trips. Both of their children were in college, so that was not a problem. David's idea was to work on his book and volunteer at the school. Before he could be of much service, though, he would have to learn sign language. A young boy with blonde hair and blue eyes, also named David, was assigned to teach him. David studied and practiced at home and worked for an hour every day at the school with his young friend. When he learned that the boy liked baseball, he drove back to the city and bought some baseball cards. He also dug out his mitt and began to play catch with the boy. David Cottle enjoyed learning sign language. It made words, and especially the act of communicating, come alive for him. Every time he spoke with his young friend, he felt as if he was sharing a secret and not just speaking empty words. Talk is cheap, he thought to himself. I have discovered the richness of language. Even the things he spoke about, water, trees, clouds, happiness, sadness, took on a new life for him, became more real, because of the signs. David was supposed to be a volunteer assistant at the school, and he did help out in many ways, but he felt as if he was the one who was doing all the learning. All of the people at the school, from the youngest children to the nuns who ran it, were kind and patient with him. The school was Catholic and David was Presbyterian, but this difference did not trouble him. He had always believed in an ecumenical approach, and this school embodied it as no other place he'd ever seen. With a shock, he realized that he was living, and not just writing, the language of faith. The children who came here were truly a diverse group. They came from families of every race and creed, rich and poor and in between. The only thing they had in common was their deafness. And though the world regarded it as a handicap, David found himself thinking how lucky these children were, that this disability had brought them to this wonderful place, where, apart from the mad clatter, they were given sustenance and learning, love and guidance. And he, too, was among the fortunate. Denise had cleared the weeds and bushes from the flower and vegetable gardens and was preparing for her spring planting. This was no haphazard endeavor on her part. She had made detailed sketches of exactly what went where. In the meantime, she was working on restoring the farmhouse. With the owner's permission, she had started on the upstairs bathroom, removing years of grime from the washstand and clawfoot bathtub, taking up the linoleum and putting down a new tile floor, replacing the dark old wallpaper with new, in a bright floral pattern. David was amazed at both her ambition and skill, and when she finished the bathroom, she started in on their bedroom. David worked on his book, and he was pleased with its progress because it seemed to him that he was learning the language even as he recorded it. The subject was alive in everything he did. Even the work Denise was doing on the old house, wasn't that an act of faith? He began to think about the connections between faith and creation. He and Denise had enough money to meet their obligations. Both his church and the Catholic Church contributed to a fund that supported his work with the children. His book was published, and it became a bestseller. It was the #1 nonfiction book of the year. David used the proceeds from the book to set up an endowment for the school, and additional funding came from generous contributions by readers, thousands of them, who wanted to support the work of the school. David was offered the position of co-leader of the school, but he refused, telling the nuns that he was satisfied to continue in his capacity as a volunteer. One day when he was playing catch with young David, the boy's attention was distracted, and David, not noticing this, threw the ball anyway. He saw in alarm that the ball was going to strike the boy in the head, and he shouted, "Look out!" The boy did not hear him, of course. The ball clipped the top of his head and bounded away. He jerked his head down, then rubbed the spot and looked at David, who was running toward him to see if he was all right. He was, and they resumed their game. No one but David had heard him speak. The sound had startled him. When he was alone driving home, he spoke again to test his voice. "Hello," he said, amazed at the sound of it. And he thought, if I tell no one, I can stay. Almost desperately, he wanted to stay. At the farmhouse, David parked the car, walked inside, stopped by the door, and said, "Denise?" She came down the stairs with a shocked look on her face. "David?" she said. He nodded his head. "I can talk," he said. My voice just came back. She rushed to him and hugged him. "Oh, David, I'm so glad," she said. "Yes," he said, "now we can go back." She looked at him. "You don't want to go back," she said, "do you?" "I don't know," he said. "This is so unexpected." Then he put his hands to his face and said, "Why did this happen? Why did all of this happen?" She said, "I'm sorry, David. I don't know." He said, "I'm not egotistical enough to think that God is directly concerned with my life, to punish me or reward me. You know me well enough to know that the only blasphemy I can imagine is for someone to believe that they have been chosen or damned by God." She said, "Yes, I know that." "Nevertheless," he said, trying to collect his thoughts, which seemed to be rushing in every direction in his mind like wind, "nevertheless, I believe that through this accident God has called me to be here, for us to be here. This is where we belong." "We can stay," Denise said. "We can buy the house." "Are you sure?" he said. "It's been in their family for years." Denise laughed. I called Linda and asked her about it today, she said. It's ours if we want it. I think we belong here, David said. The seeds blow and they land where they land. Some are luckier than others and they take root and grow into trees. I think we have found our place and our life's work. I think we belong here.